coming. I'm going to give a presentation, and it's going to be about, in the end, I'll get to my final analysis of the final environmental impact statement for the Hills PDD in Southampton. As an overview, though, I'm going to start by giving some background about why I care and why I think we should care about this region. Just update everyone with regard to where my analysis was for the draft environmental impact statement, and then I'll get to my analysis of the final environmental impact statement. I have a good number of slides that I'm leading in with, but I think that part is important. That is why we're here in the first place. So let's, and I'm definitely going to be, the purpose is to take questions and give answers also. So let me get through my slides. If you have questions, maybe just write them down as I go. If something's totally unclear, I'll answer a short question as I go, because I wouldn't want people to be totally confused the whole time. But if you have longer questions, some substantive questions, if we can hold those to the end, I'm happy to stay here as long as it takes to answer all those questions. Okay. So just as way of background, I think we're all aware of the idea Long Island is a watershed, and any activity on land affects what happens in our groundwater beneath us, and then thereafter in the receiving waters, be they ponds, streams, rivers, estuaries, bays, harbors, etc. And so we're talking about here the proposed PDD of the Hills in East Quogue, or the Hills in Southampton. And so, through the years of studying this, I've come to recognize or learn, actually via the Sub-County Water Authority, the general flow of groundwater and the way it flows essentially from the northwest towards Weesuck Creek and Shinnecock Bay. And in work done with the consulting firm CDM, they've used their overall groundwater model to figure out how long it takes groundwater to go from land to sea, and have calculated that from the southern extent of the Hills property to Weesuck Creek is about a 5-year travel time with regards to groundwater. If you went to the northern part of the property, it would be significantly longer. And then just to talk about when that groundwater hits the coastal waters, the first thing it would hit would be a salt marsh. Salt marshes are important, obviously, in marine ecosystems because they are important for supporting fisheries, but also even important for terrestrial mammals and bird populations. They're also really important, we've come to recognize since Hurricane Sandy, we knew it before, but it came to light during Hurricane Sandy, for protecting coastal communities. If you want to protect a coastal community, you want to have a strong salt marsh system intact. This is shown very well here. This is actually a storm. This water here is actually on top of the salt marsh. And this is the fringing edge of the salt marsh, and so what it shows is the ability of salt marshes to take the brunt of storms and protect coastal communities from flooding and storm surge. About the same time as Hurricane Sandy, a study came out that made the most definitive link to date, showing that when you excessively load nitrogen to a salt marsh, the roots of that salt marsh begin to weaken, and the overall salt marsh begins to collapse. And we know on Long Island, be you talking about Nassau County or Suffolk County, the North Shore, the South Shore, the East End, we've lost somewhere between 20 and 80% of our salt marshes. Now, when we look at Weesuck Creek and the area just downgrading of the groundwater flow from the Hills property, there are salt marshes. In fact, on both shores, there's excessive salt marshes, and further, you can see there are communities built up right against those salt marshes, meaning that those salt marshes are important for protecting those communities. An interesting note about those salt marshes and the whole idea of sea level rise, this is a pretty curious photo. This is Weesuck Creek. This is a tree, right? It's the shoreline. How did it get there? This is evident, what this is evidence of sea level rise. And the fact that we need to be aware going forward that we need to be thinking about how we're going to protect our coastal communities. This is where obviously the sea level used to be further out here. It's no longer, this is no longer obviously a tree. It was many decades, probably even centuries ago. So that's evidence of sea level rise happening here on Long Island. Here's the flooding that occurred during Hurricane Sandy, and you can see the coastal communities right there were flooded. But if these salt marshes were not here actually absorbing that flood waters, the flooding to East Quogue would have been much worse. And you can see the flooding went across Montauk Highway. And again, salt marshes here protecting this community. So these salt marshes are very important for that purpose. This is a study that I did at Stony Brook University as part of responding to Hurricane Sandy to try to project what we think it will happen with regard to flooding in the 21st century. So what we expect by the year 2050 and the year 2100, and you can see it doesn't look great in many areas, and that's with the salt marshes intact. If we lose those further, we'll have to be experiencing even worse flooding. So these salt marshes are critically important for the community of East Quogue. And that's why, after Hurricane Sandy, the DEC put out this technical briefing to essentially make the linkage between protecting coastal communities against flooding and reducing nitrogen loads. And again, in East Quogue, it's only 5 years from where the PDD is to Weesuck Creek. Beyond the salt marsh, Shinnecock Bay is officially listed by the DEC as a impaired water body. The levels of nitrogen in groundwater around East Quogue and western Shinnecock Bay are quite high. The levels of nitrogen in the water are also quite high, in fact exceeding the guidance level for the US EPA of 0.4 milligrams per liter in many regions. In the water, there are threats to human health and ecology. On the human health front, we worry about alexandrium. This is a toxic dinoflagellate that makes the compound saxitoxin, which is 1,000 times more potent than cyanide. So something we need to be worried about. It can be lethal and has been lethal around the world and in this country. And it occurs on a fairly regular basis in western Shinnecock Bay. So we've had closures of shellfish beds, you can see, multiple times in the past several years. And as it turns out, the epicenter for these events is in Weesuck Creek. And that's shown doubly here. Here are cell densities of the responsible organism that leads to PSP. You can see highest within Weesuck Creek, declining thereafter. And the DEC knows it as well because they can see the toxicity of the shellfish. So in this particular year, when they began to roll back the shellfish closure, this was the only area that was closed only to bivalves, shellfish and gastropods. The rest of the area just being closed to gastropods because they knew this was the area that's the most toxic. That's the epicenter where these events are happening. And further evidence in 2014, when they looked at all the places that had some PSP, Weesuck Creek had the highest levels of saxitoxin. And again, just showing, if you look at where the cell densities are on a log scale, the maximum is in Weesuck Creek. And prior research in my lab has demonstrated high levels of nitrogen not only gives you more of the cells in the water, but because the molecule saxitoxin that is toxic to humans contains nitrogen, more nitrogen makes it more toxic. Outside of human health and other algal blooms in Great South Bay, we know we need to worry about brown tide, which is responsible for the loss of a lot of eelgrass, as well as the loss of 2 major shell fisheries in Shinnecock Bay. And further, if you look at the cell densities of brown tide going from the inlet, this is historically going back to the western part of Shinnecock Bay, they're highest in the area of western Shinnecock Bay. And I should say, you probably know, promoted by nitrogen. Seagrass beds are an important habitat in marine ecosystems for supporting shellfish and finfish. We've lost 90% of our seagrass beds here on Long Island. Suffolk County predicts we may lose all of them if we don't change course with regards to nitrogen loading, because we know that increasing nitrogen loading leads to the loss of seagrass. And it's happening very rapidly. So here's a survey that was done in 2006, not that long ago, but a decade ago. And then here's a survey done less than 10 years later, essentially showing that that same area in western Shinnecock Bay that used to have eelgrass no longer has it. And again, we know this is linked to excessive nitrogen loading. And then just the final things on shellfish. I already talked about the loss of shellfish. We know why that's happening. It's because of a lack of recruitment. A lot of information in this bay, in this slide, but it's with regards to the settlement of the larval early life stage to different types of shellfish: scallops, mussels, Capitula, which is a snail, the arc clam. In the western part of the bay, we have lots of these larvae settling and surviving in the in the eastern part of the bay. Lots settling and surviving. In the eastern part of the bay, including areas like Weesuck Creek, no settlement, no survival. Which means that the habitat is not suitable, be it harmful algae or otherwise. And this is just showing it by map, where we're seeing those bivalve larvae settle and where they're not. And when it comes to fish, the fish that we like to catch, there's a large abundance of them in the eastern part of the bay. It's a collaborative project through Shinnecock Bay, and we see less and less when we get to the west as it being a poor habitat. So the risks of too much nitrogen include flooding, a human health risk, the degradation of the bay, and I won't go into the details, but the Stony Brook University is finishing a study right now showing that up to 2% of your home value is linked to the clarity of the water in the closest water body. And so you can multiply 2% times the value of your home and think about what that cost is to you as an individual. I also want to mention, beyond what's going on, that instead of just documenting this, I've been personally have put in a tremendous effort in the last 6 years to try to reverse these trends. And in 2012, I started the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program. I've raised $5 million towards restoring seagrass and bivalves within this ecosystem, focusing on oysters, clams, and seagrasses. And this is a science-based restoration program hitting multiple species, putting them where we think and we know they're going to survive. So there's been plantings and regrowth of seagrass. And we've also established hard clam spawner sanctuaries in western Shinnecock Bay, collaborating with the Southampton Town Trustees. We have 2 spawner sanctuary areas where we're planting hard clams. We've planted more than 2 million hard clams, adult hard clams, reproducing hard clams, since 2012. These are individuals that we know are going to be able to reproduce. And since that time, we found they're all surviving, and their reproductive fitness seems to be very, very high. And further, in the last year, we've seen a significant increase in the numbers of clams that are showing up in Shinnecock Bay. And in fact, if you go out there and look right now, you'll see there are more people out there clamming than have been in years. And so our survey data is showing that, random grab samples are showing that, these small clams showing up, and this is for the first time in a decade. And this got the attention of Governor Cuomo. You may know he was here in May because I described to him this program. He took great interest in it. And frankly, I've spent a good part of the summer working with the governor to put together a statewide plan modeled after the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program. As of now, he's due to announce that this Wednesday. We'll see. The governor sometimes changes his plan. But he's taken great interest in the success we've had at Shinnecock Bay. And like I said, I've invested a lot in that program, and I want to see that success continue. All right. Now, moving on to the issue at hand, with that as a warm-up. I want to remind you where my analysis stood with regards to the draft environmental impact statement of the hills. And as a point of emphasis, the DEC has put together something known as the Long Island Nitrogen Action Plan, and a whole group of individuals and organizations that are part of that involved in something called the sub-watershed studies, which is looking at the loading of nitrogen from land to sea all across Suffolk County. It's also being done for Nassau County. In Suffolk County, I'm on, as you can see, well, I'm part of the subcommittee involved in this. In Nassau County, I'm actually leading the nitrogen loading modeling effort for the DEC. But the important and salient point here is that the information that I use for my analysis is not just me whistling in the wind, it's not just me taking my best guess, but rather it's me going to bi-weekly meetings for over the past year, interacting with individuals from all these different organizations, federal organizations like the EPA, USGS, other universities, Suffolk County, the DEC, to best understand how nitrogen moves from land to sea in Suffolk County and on eastern Long Island. So using that information, this is where my environmental impact, the draft environmental impact statement, nitrogen loading, stood. And so I had 4 different conditions that I considered. The existing conditions, the PDD, the as of right, and I'm calling it as of right low and as of right high. So to walk you through some of the finer points here, with regards to the existing conditions, I note that more than half of the existing nitrogen loading comes from fertilizer, and I'll just point out that, and it's agricultural fertilizer. That comes specifically from two plots, one on what's known as the Parlato property, and one that's known as the Cracky farm. I use a default estimated loading of nitrogen associated with that. However, I've had people come to me and tell me they don't think there's actually nitrogen loading in those areas, fertilizer going on actively in those areas. There may be, I assume that there is, but I just put that in as a caveat that this total number is with that fertilizer in there, and assuming that there actually is fertilization at the rates assumed for these areas. With regards to the two different as-of-right conditions, I'll note that the low as-of-right was modeled similarly to the way the Hills development is being put together, also similar to what the group for the East End put together, and then also looking at the actual data, because I should say that I've done similar models like this for all sorts of hamlets through the town of Southampton, going from Speonk to Remsenburg to West Hampton to Quogue to East Quogue, Hampton Bay, Southampton, Southampton Village, and so I have a sense of what is reality in this part of Southampton with regards to, for example, an average lot size or the amount of clearing that goes on. And so that was part of the as-of-right low, either using what had already been suggested by the group for the East End or just doing a reality check. Does the number that's being put in line up with what we already know? And when I say about these areas, I should also say my prior analysis is done using GIS. So it's not sort of eyeballing it, but it's using, for example, satellite imagery and actually carving out what's the size of a lawn here, using, for example, vegetation information in the New York State GIS portal. The as-of-right high was specifically focused on the as-of-right that had been put together within the PDD. So what was the estimated as-of-right and some of the assumptions made by the consultants who worked for Discovery Land with regards to amount of lawn, amount of clearing, rate of fertilizer, and things of that nature. And then for the PDD, obviously, I specifically also relied on all the information in there. And I will say, with regards to some of the numbers that the consultants had put together, that values were actually quite similar for existing, and I think not too far off for the PDD. Our values were far off for the high value as of right. Just as an example of some of the reasons that maybe that high estimate was off, there's a lot of data out there to dig into locally about many different aspects. But I just bring this up as an example. So the question all along has been, well, will this development be year-round or seasonal? And that goes for both the PDD or as of right. And so what this table here shows, and the font is very small, and that's because it's a lot of information. It could be made any well anyway. The salient point is this is the United States Census from 2010, and the Suffolk County Planning Department taking that data. And essentially what it just shows is that there are almost equal number of people living in East Quogue, maybe even a little bit more, seasonal than year-round. Right? So East Quogue is not a year-round community. Right? There's seasonal people, there's year-round. And so that's just the reality. That's what the Suffolk County Planning Department tells us, U.S. Census data tells us. So it doesn't make sense to not use that kind of assumption. The other important point with regards to the PDD is that it involves, and my analysis of it, based on the draft environmental impact statement, is that it involves the idea of fertigation, the using of groundwater to essentially fertilize and water at the same time, the golf course and the golf course within the PDD. And so I think that's a really interesting, novel, and potentially very useful way to mitigate nitrogen. However, as I said when I wrote the draft environmental impact statement, it's never been done on Long Island. To my knowledge, it's been done in different ways, but no one's ever taken just groundwater and used that groundwater to fertilize the golf course. And so there are many questions regarding it. How well will it work? how stable will the nitrogen concentrations be in the groundwater that are being used. I'm certain that there will be some level of nitrogen removal with the fertigation, and it may be a home run. But with no data, as a scientist, in my mind, there's no way to quantify how useful this approach will be. Because again, I said, it's never been done before, and there are many open questions. Okay, so with that as my background on the draft environmental impact statement, I want to move on to the last part, which is my evaluation of the final environmental impact statement for the hills. And so this was made easier for me because the supervisor, Jay Schneiderman, sent me this letter. I hope it's not a confidential letter. No, for everyone. But no, being serious, he specifically asked me, he said, look, the FEIS is different. They've made significant changes. And he said, please consider 6 different, or there's 4 here, but I'll show you the 6 that I considered, a couple other things that weren't in the draft DEIS, for the reanalysis. And so I think I have those here. So these are the 6 things that I looked at in my analysis that differed from the draft environmental impact statement. So they included preserving 33 acres of land in the headwaters of Weesuck Creek, the purchase of 30 pine barren credits. I'm going to go through all these, so I'm just giving you the summary now. Putting an on-site wastewater treatment system on the hills at Southampton development, putting a sewage treatment plant at the East Quogue Elementary School, putting a cap on the amount of fertilizer being used on the property to 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And then the last thing is something that actually I did not put in the draft environmental impact statement. I probably should have, so it's something I overlooked, and that is within the PDD is a $1 million fund to upgrade septic systems within the East Quogue community. So I added that in as well to my analysis of the final environmental impact statement. So I'm going to go through step by step. So there are 33 acres that are located within the headwaters of Weesuck Creek that are available to be purchased. And so the consideration I made was, what if these were purchased? And actually 2 scenarios. I think the intention through the PDD is to preserve it, but the alternative is, what if it's developed? And so for the development, I noted, again, I had good guidance from the town of Southampton that this is 1 acre zoning, and so out of Kyle Collins' department, they estimated 30 homes being built in this particular property. And so what I did for my analysis is I actually, rather than taking that away from the PDD, although I'll note this would do the same thing, I added it to the as of right. Because the idea would be, if the PDD doesn't go, then this gets developed and you've got a 30-acre development. And so by doing that, what you can see, I had the 2 different scenarios for the as of right, the low and high as of right, again with the low being what I think is actually more realistic with regards to number of people, amount of lawns, amount of clearing, the seasonality of people, but then I also used the high, essentially the same parameters I used in the draft environmental impact statement. And you can see that both of those now increase. The next thing I considered was the purchasing of 30 pine barren credits. I am by no means an expert in the way pine barren credits work. My best understanding is the idea is that there are areas where you can buy these credits. There are particular areas that then are, I believe, someone can nod their head and say yes, within the compatible growth zone. And then if they are purchased and extinguished, then that area can never be developed. Alternatively, I think they can be purchased and then there can be, those credits can be used to develop elsewhere within a given zone. And so, in accordance with the town guidance, I considered that those 30 pine barren credits would be converted into 30 additional homes. And again, like in the last situation, I added those homes specifically to the as of right. Although again, I'll mention that if you took it away from the PDD, it would do the same thing. But it was the idea of we have 30 homes that now you can expand the size of what the as of right PDD would be. Now I put those 30 homes using the Hills property. So assuming that those Pine Barren credits land within the Hills property. I had several conversations with the planning department of the town of Southampton, Kyle Collins' staff, and it seems that it's not 100% certain that would happen. That is, they may not all land there, and I believe there needs to be approval for that to happen. But what I will emphasize is that the amount of loading associated with it probably wouldn't change too much if it was located in a different watershed, or if they were split amongst watersheds. Although, if it was, say, in West Hampton, which is another area where they could land, that nitrogen loading wouldn't be to Shinnecock Bay, it may instead be to Moriches Bay. But it's still from land to sea. So with those caveats, you can see how that changed the two as-of-right scenarios. The next thing I considered was the installation of an on-site wastewater treatment system for the Hills itself. They're looking at something called a basswood system that will reduce nitrogen loading to 10 milligrams per liter. And that was a very simple one. And so that would decrease the amount of nitrogen loading going from the PDD towards Weesuck Creek. And I note that in my DEIS, I had already put in the assumption that the Hills at Southampton would be using innovative and advanced on-site technology, because as of January 1 of this year, Suffolk County plans to have all new construction use these advanced systems. But this reduces even beyond that, the advanced to 10 milligrams per liter, whereas the on-site systems only go down to 19. I also assumed that there'd be again, according to the FEIS, a sewage treatment plant for the East Quogue Elementary School. And for that, I assumed treatment to 10 milligrams per liter. You make a series of assumptions with regards to how many children equals an adult. Also with regards to, but it, did other things that were simpler. There's 180 school days a year. The kids are in school for 6 hours. The adults are in school for 8 hours. There's some use of the building at night. So through all that, putting in the sewage treatment plant had this effect, reducing more than 300, I should say the units, I haven't said it, pounds of nitrogen per year. So that's reduction by getting the PDD instead of the as-of-right development. The next was the fertilizer cap at 2 pounds per year per 1,000 square feet. And this had essentially two effects. One is that in my DEIS analysis, because I assumed that the fertigation would not be removing nitrogen, and it said this specifically in the DEIS, that if it didn't remove X amount of nitrogen, then there'd have to be additional fertilizer added. And so part of my analysis in the DEIS was actually adding in that fertilizer that would be needed for the golf course, because the fertigation wouldn't hit the level that would be expected. And so the two things, so the one effect that had is I pulled that away. There's almost 500 pounds that I assumed they'd have to add because the fertigation wouldn't work. And then also there was a small reduction at this level, the amount of fertilizer that would go to the creeks, tees, greens, and fairways. But collectively, this had a large effect on the amount of nitrogen coming from the PDD. You can see so over 750 pounds per year. And then the last thing I considered was the $1 million that would go towards supporting community-wide septic upgrades in East Quogue. As you may know, last summer Suffolk County passed something known as an update to the health code known as Article 19, which approves alternative septic systems that remove more nitrogen. The only ones that have been approved are those that can reduce nitrogen down to 19 milligrams per liter. And these systems are now being installed. So there's good information out there now of what it costs to install one of these. It's about $25,000, all things included. And so that leads to about 40 homes being upgraded. And so with that, that also leads to a significant reduction in the amount of nitrogen, 384 pounds per year. And so I think that gets me to the end then. So with regards to the FEIS, my final assessment, here are the final numbers as they come out. And you can see I also put in how the FEIS changed my final analysis relative to what was present in the DEIS. So with that, we'll conclude simply with these bullet points that excessive nitrogen provides significant ecosystem, human health, property, and property value risk to East Quogue and the region. And that nitrogen loading, as described in the DEIS for the PDD, exceeded the as-of-right scenarios. But with the 6 changes made for the PDD within the FEIS, reduced nitrogen loadings for the hills in Southampton, increased the loading rates for the as-of-right, and led to a situation where the PDD would then, have a lower nitrogen yield. So I'm done, and so with that I'm going to turn on the lights, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. Bob.
Thanks. I mean, first, before I ask my question, I think I speak for a lot of people in saying, thank you for the time, effort, and energy. A lot of people know of your work. I know sort of how busy you are on a regular basis, and I think that you've done all of us a great service in terms of the time that you've committed to this pro bono for the town. Frankly, I don't know what the town would have done if you didn't happen to live in the neighborhood, so thank you for that. I have a main question and maybe 2 follow-ups. The main question is, it looks like the letter from the town sort of directed you to do what you did, but there were lots of other alternatives considered during the discussion in the public hearings. So, were you able to look at any of that, and if you were able to look at any of that, what did you find? And then my follow-ups can come after that.
I really just focused on those 6 changes that were within the FEIS, as well as the one that I didn't include in the DEIS, but I didn't think about other scenarios.
And the town's letter appears to have limited you just to the PDD.
That was the request. Yeah.
Okay. So stepping outside of that ballpark, we have issues obviously with what alternatives should be considered, what the town should be looking at with each scenario. But anyway, on the 30-acre piece that you looked at, the one that's proposed for dedication, the nitrogen numbers from that, were those considered as standard septic systems or advanced treatment?
Advanced.
Okay.
So for all my scenarios, I always use advanced systems because, again, the county is planning on insisting on that for all new development as of January 1st, 2018.
And then on the $1 million fund, which is voluntary as I understand it, how do you quantify, how do you put a number on that, knowing that maybe everybody participates, maybe some people participate? What was the thinking behind that? I
just assumed that you'd get 40 homes and 40 people would participate. I mean, on the one side, by participating, you'd get a free septic system, but you'd also get maintenance fees and operation fees that you wouldn't have in the past. And so that would be a potential deterrent. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are also funds available from the town of Southampton and from Suffolk County that may make it easier and even more homes signing.
So the assessment was that fully subscribed $1 million out across?
Correct. 40 homes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. More questions? Larry?
What if there were no homes, no golf course? Wouldn't that be the best alternative?
Well, you'll note that I'm glad you said it that way, and I'm going to say I'm not here to tell you what the best alternative is. And I didn't get a chance to say this. That really, I mean, let's be frank. I'm looking just at one thing, nitrogen loading. And I think that's important because I'm looking at protecting the bays. I know that's a major culprit. But we all know, and we all recognize there's a lot more to think about than that. And so, and I won't go through the litany, but everyone, I'm sure, in this room can think of the things that are most important to them with regards to development. And so when it comes to best, that would be like someone's opinion. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Gold. My name is Bill White. I think we've been communicating and part of the very interested parties here. We just sold, Brian and I were married, we just sold our house down the road on 42 Ocean View Drive with the excitement that we would be buying a house in the hills when and if this was to be approved. And I think I spoke at one of the meetings at the East Quogue hearing, saying I'm looking forward to being the neighbors and the people in the room who for and against, if this thing does get through. One thing, having run the Intrepid Museum for 20 years. We were very involved with the ecosystem of the Hudson River. I want to salute you and thank you, because this is, you're not getting paid for this. This is not part of your job, and you spent a lot of time and effort, into this. And whether I'm for it or not for the hills, I want to thank you, because it's nice to have people like you care about the environment, care about the neighbors, and want to contribute to a better world for all of us. And I just wanted to say that, is it your opinion that from these three conclusions, the best of all worlds would be to do nothing there, but that the plan that is currently being considered is better than as of right, and for two guys who care about the environment, we feel better about buying a house there now because it's going to actually not pollute as bad as other things could?
Yeah, so, I mean, again, better, best, that's not for me to evaluate. I think what I'll do is I'll just go back. I mean, I'll let the numbers just speak for themselves. And, and again, I think when you get to the qualitative things of what's best, there's a lot to consider. What I mean to simply say is, yes, the numbers bear out that as of now, the PDD has a lower nitrogen load than the as of right scenario that I consider. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Yes.
Chris, if you took the 6 mitigation measures that were in the DEIS and applied them to the as of right, low and high, are you able to state how that would impact nitrogen loading?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that that's how it would impact it.
But I mean, to the as of right, if you took those.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that if you took this, you'd, these would be lower by that much as mitigation measures. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
So the question was, what if you took the 6 mitigation measures and you applied it to the as of right? Right, so what if you weren't doing it for the PDD, but rather you did it on what's now being considered for the as of right development? And so if you did that quantitative, so add the sewer treatment plants, the additional upgrades within the town, limiting the amount of fertilizer. So I guess actually not all, but the fertilizer wouldn't count. But anyway, it would end up reducing the amount of the as of rights because you're now mitigating nitrogen in ways that aren't being considered for the PDD.
Al Jury for the East Quogue ticket. My question is simple. We have 4,000 bad cesspools now in Southampton town, and we have $1 million fund offered. How many cesspools or homes would be saved with that $1 million?
40 homes.
So 40 out of 4,000. It's not a very generous thing for the environment, I can tell you that. And you keep saying the as of right almost has no control over the environment. That's what Discovery Land has been saying for 3.5 years. The as of right has the same controls if they're applied by the town as they should be. And that's a deep concern. The other concern is you're not addressing traffic. 5,000 truckloads from the sand mine going onto Lewis Road. Also pesticides, which has come up most recently. We have a picture how they're applied at Sabonic, and there's no other way to apply pesticides to keep the grass green for 8 months. That's going to be playing golf. It's not a seasonal resort. The pesticide will have to be applied in the hottest days of the summer. There's no plan in there for the as of right saying the same problem's going to apply. Thank you.
So, just as a quick yes, I own. This is only considering nitrogen loading, and so that's a fair point. I will just say, as far as the reason your point about town restrictions agree, and that's one of the reasons I put in these 2 different versions of the as of right. But I'm not an expert in town planning, but there could be even more restrictions. Ron had his hand up first in the back. Go ahead.
According to your figures, at the optimum of mitigation that PDE was offered, that's 2,300 pounds of nitrogen a year. In your opinion, what will the impact of that be on Weesuck Creek or the rest of Weesuck Creek
mean, it's more nitrogen, so it's, you know, we know that those sorts of things, I gave my intro, that, you know, that makes potentially the algal blooms more intense and negative effects on the ecosystem.
So it's a no-win situation for the bank, basically.
It's, yeah, no, well,
I'm saying.
okay. Yes, sir.
First of all, I want to be clear, I'm part of the association at Algeria's, and I'm in favor of the Hills project, so you know where I'm coming from. What I'd like to know is, if everybody, there's 4,000 homes, you're saying 1% would be eligible for this $1 million. If the other 3,900 were, or 3,960 were then required to remove the septic, their sewage from their septic system on a regular basis, let's say every 2 years or 3 years, how would that impact the nitrogen level going into the ground?
So, and just for if everybody could hear the point, the question was, what if everybody, of the people not getting upgraded systems, were pumping their septic systems twice a year?
No, every 2 years.
Every 2 years. Actually, that wouldn't really do anything, believe it or not, because 70% of the nitrogen in wastewater is actually from the liquids. And when they pump, they're actually cleaning out the solids. And the liquids are going all the time, not to get to the dirty details here. But and so the real key would be, I mean, if there's a system that's failing entirely, that would help. But if things are operating as they normally would, it wouldn't be a huge help. However, there will, because of the passage of the Community Preservation Fund last fall, that included 20% of funds for addressing water quality issues. There should be funds available from the town of Southampton, and also Suffolk County is working on a rebate program as well. And so rather than just pumping the systems, there will be funds available for the other 3,900 plus people to voluntarily upgrade their systems. Which may help.
And that would reduce the nitrogen level.
Correct, because those all reduced down to 19 milligrams per liter, and that's significantly lower. Effluent can be anywhere from a normal system from 50 or 60 up to over 100 milligrams per liter, depending on.
And I'd like to point out that although there are other issues involved here, I mean, we think it's important enough to put nitrogen in the ground by the preservation of our farmland. And if I was born and raised here, and this whole town survives on second and third homes. If it wasn't for second and third homes, we wouldn't have the beautiful community throughout the town that we have. And when you stop developing, controlled development, which this is, you're going to end up with a dead community. It's going to turn into something that we're all going to wish we didn't allow. So, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Bob, and then come over here.
Chris, you mentioned that the possibility of the irrigation well tapping into the nitrogen plume has the potential to be a home run, but you've discounted it in your calculations. I understand that. But would you entertain, at least as a reasonable hypothesis, the idea that that irrigation well could pump out a couple thousand pounds of nitrogen a year, put it on the golf course, and actually reduce the PDD to below the existing?
I think that, well, they're 1,000 apart. I'd have to run the numbers. I'm certain there'll be some nitrogen removal, but I have to be really spitballing it to I can't say it right now. I certainly could do that if the town were interested. I could, maybe come with an absolute minimum. But that being said, like I said, there's not a lot of basis for doing that. There'll be some removal. I'm very comfortable saying that. I'm certain there'll be some removal, but quantifying that because of the uncertainty with regards to the groundwater sources as well as prior data on the approach, for me, it's very difficult. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm George Lynch. I live in Quogue. I want to add my thanks to those of everyone else for everything that you have done. It's an extraordinary amount of work. Question and a clarification. About the existing situation, in both cases, you've got 1,210 pounds with two components, and the 660, I believe, from the earlier slide is agricultural.
Correct.
The 550 is other. Do you know what that other is? Mostly residential, industrial, what?
Actually, it's something that's atmospheric deposition.
Okay.
And so both rain and then even on a beautiful day like this, there's dust particles falling out that have nitrogen, some of it from, say, the Midwest and from industrial plants. And so that's actually the main aspect.
Okay, thank you. And then to clarify, in just comparing the existing situation with the PDD, because I personally believe that the as-of-rights are entirely unrealistic from a market point of view. That's outside the scope of this discussion, I understand. Just comparing the existing with the PDD, I believe in your numbers without the FEIS changes, it was 1,210 versus 4,100. Is that right?
That sounds right, yes.
So that has the PDD with nitrogen loading of almost 3.5 times the existing situation.
Correct.
Right? And with this, which we have on the slide, with the 6 FEIS changes, it's 1,210 versus 2,300, which is with the PDD being almost twice the amount of nitrogen loading as the existing situation.
Correct.
Thank you.
Bill?
First, one last thing about this chart. With the as-of-right low and the as-of-right high, I don't understand, have there been mitigation, the same mitigation scenarios applied to those two scenarios?
No.
So you're assuming that as-of-right is not going to be mitigated at all. You're assuming that there's going to be no pushback from the community. You're assuming that there's going to be nothing done, that the as-of-right, in fact, is going to be untouched. So in essence, what I see here is that you're looking at a scenario where a PDD is fully mitigated, and you're having an as-of-right low, an as-of-right high with absolutely no mitigation, which is not reality-based at all.
Well, I mean, I think it is a realistic assessment in that the things that are in the PDD are being brought in because the Discovery is paying for it.
Right.
And so if Discovery is not doing the PDD, then it's not clear to me how those measures, who would be paying for those measures to be applied in an as-of-right scenario.
But what you're assuming in this is that there will be no environmental checks on any PDD or any
Well,
as-of-right development.
so that's why I had the range in here. And so the low as-of-right is making sure everything is to the letter with regards to town code. And also using realistic assumptions with regards to seasonality and with regards to
So as-of-right low is full build-out with mitigation.
I wouldn't say
Or
with
so-
mitigation.
The town code.
Yes.
All right, so no mitigation and as-of-right low. Okay.
With, I'm just gonna say that's with individual wastewater IA systems.
Correct. Correct.
On each home.
19 milligrams per liter. That's right.
Which right now isn't required, only in the 2-year zone, which I think the 30-acre piece, 33-acre piece is in the 2-year zone. But
Part of it is.
I don't think the larger piece is.
Yeah. I split that in half, with half being in the 2-year zone and half being, or no, half being within 200 meters and half being.
Just on Bill's point, I think what he's saying, if I understand it, is because of the secret process mandates that towns consider mitigation as part of their responsibility, whether it's a PDD or any other project, it's reasonable to assume that you're going to have mitigation measures, which isn't for you to have to worry about, but during the planning process. So there's the potential to sort of see this as an apples to oranges kind of comparison, in that all of the benefits of the nitrogen mitigation proposed in the FEIS are applied to the PDD, which is fine. And we really don't have anything comparable to apply to the others. And I just think for clarification that's important, so that we know if we have a 200-pound difference between 2,300 and 2,500, that's prior to the imposition of any planning mitigation that might come in the as-of-right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How can you say yes? Because, I mean, if it's an as-of-right, they can build as-of-right.
We can't give extra.
Just to summarize, I think it's the idea that there could be additional mitigation measures applied to the as of right condition, which would, and I don't. That's the idea that's being put forth, and then some people believe that wouldn't be the case.
Well, what is it? What are the mitigations that are being
I'm
put
as
forward?
not being a town planner, I don't know. Like I said, what I do know is the PDD has very specific concrete details that they're paying for, and that's what was included. I suppose that I don't know what would go in a normal development that's sort of outside the scope.
How far, I'm sorry.
Please.
How far are they off from the comprehensive plan, the hills?
I'm not sure what you mean by that question.
Well, the comprehensive plan was developed based on input from all the communities, and the hamlet of East Quogue was one of them. Now, how far off of the comprehensive plan is the hills development?
I guess I'm not familiar enough with the comprehensive plan to comment. I don't know.
Can I comment quick on what the town, if it went through a traditional planning process through the
Please.
planning board?
Please.
The planning board, particularly when you're doing something the size of, over 50 lot subdivision, in this case it's probably 118 plus subdivision, it would go through an EIS as well. So there'd be a full environmental review. The planning board could likely require these individual sanitary systems, maybe even a sewage treatment. What it can't do is it can't require things unrelated, like the sewage treatment for the school. That would be unconstitutional. In fact, the Supreme Court has ruled on this. It couldn't say go buy another 30 acres or 33 acres somewhere else. But it can do mitigation on the parcel itself that's directly mitigating the environmental impacts.
Thanks, Dr. Gobler. Just a quick question. The shellfish restoration that we've committed to, is this included in the analysis also?
It's not. It could be. In general, the bivalves do remove nitrogen, but recognize that that's only the nitrogen that's in their tissue. So it's not a tremendous amount, but it could be added in. I didn't add it in because it's not clear how many bivalves there'd be, where it would be, etc. My guess is that we'd be talking. I probably shouldn't guess. I don't think it'd be a huge game changer, but it could certainly be added in. And I should say that actually. I wanted to make this point. If there's substantial information that people think should be added and supervised, this is a dynamic model that I can change. And so if the supervisor or the town believes there are additional things that should be considered, I'm happy to I'm considering this, I've submitted this document, I'm calling it final, but I'm happy to make it dynamic and update it as the town sees fit. And so that's something that could be considered. Yeah.
I guess there's always the question that, where's the biggest bang for the buck? Because
Right.
the nitrogen.
Sure.
And that's the thing I think
Yeah.
is important to focus on.
Sure. And then I will just point out, though, it may well be that something like that, the benefit isn't necessarily the nitrogen, but rather the trickle-down ecosystem effects. So.
Chris, the Weesuck Creek area you said is already suffering from high nitrogen. A lot of the land is undeveloped in this area. As you showed, the groundwater flow is in that direction.
Yep.
So what is the primary source of nitrogen in Weesuck Creek?
Septic tanks, as well as
Are there that many
farm
homes along
fertilizer.
Weesuck Creek?
Say it again.
There are that many homes along the creek now?
Well, recognize that it, as a depression point and with the flow of groundwater, it's not just the homes on the creek, of course, but it's throughout the watershed and the whole community being delivered there.
If you follow the Dream from Weesuck Creek, it goes right through hundreds of acres of farm fields.
Correct, and so I think we're maybe talking over each other. The farm fields there are definitely a potent source of nitrogen as well, and the legacy of the farms that are north of there. That's definitely a source. And I even have data that shows that if you look at it's a little esoteric, but the isotopic composition of the nitrogen in the creek, you can see that there's a fertilizer signal So
Do you have a percentage of what's what in terms of fertilizer versus?
I have it for the whole watershed, Hampton Bays and East Quogue, it's wastewater. I haven't divvied up the pie to just look at that, include the farm and just look at that scenario, but it could be done.
So how do you fix that? How do you remove some of that nitrogen from that creek area?
It's a fair question. I mean, if the fertigation works, that would be one approach. There are other things like reactive barriers. There are in the water mitigation measures, things that we're exploring actually right here. If you look out one of the floats out here, ropes of seaweed that can absorb the nitrogen, remove it, absorb the nitrogen, and then remove the seaweeds, harvest those, and that's removing nitrogen. So there's various ways it can be done, both in the watershed and in the water. Yes, Andrew.
I have a couple of questions, sorry. One of them has to do with what would it take, the monitors that what would be required, or what would be a recommendation to monitor that there's this 2% cap with fertigation? You know, to me, what keeps coming back is the issue of the golf course, not the development itself, but the idea of a golf course in this area. And I think about the pesticides, but in this case, since we're just talking about nitrogen, I think about they're doing their best to try to mitigate it, but what if it doesn't work? How do you make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to? What would recommendation do?
I think there just would need to be careful monitoring. There has been a lot of thought put into how they would be fertilizing the property via the fertigation process. It seems complex, but on the one hand, but I mean, as described, for example, by Paul Grosser, there are ways to quantify, but somebody will need to quantify. It will need to be quantified. The concentrations of nitrogen, the volumes of water. So there's certainly, in addition to, there's going to need to be therefore monitoring.
Why can't they just use groundwater monitoring wells? Like for instance, the bridge and other golf courses required to do, and then post the data yearly for great transparency.
We're committed to that.
Okay. So
That's exactly the same process as the bridges.
Lysimeters, right?
Lysimeters, monitoring wells, quarterly reports reviewed after 5 years, Cornell University.
And my other question is require another slide, the Pine Barrens credits that are being used to reduce the amount of nitrogen that are landing in East Quogue. My sense from what I know is that, again, I'm not a total expert, but I've been living this for a lot of gray-haired long time. And my understanding is there are no Pine Barrens credits available to be purchased in East Quogue. They have to be transferred from another school district. What's the number there, and what would the difference be if they couldn't use those Pine Barrens credits as a reduction?
So, in talking with the planning department of the town of Southampton, it sounds like there could be some landed in East Quogue, but I don't know. There was a question if they could all be landed there. But the point I had made is that for my calculations, it was 30 homes, and that the numbers from my model that came out of those 30 homes weren't too far off of about 30 homes for the 33-acre development, and so the values would be quite similar, I think. But the question is, it may not be in that watershed, and therefore you'd be talking about nitrogen that's not necessarily going to Western Shinnecock Bay.
Different. Again, we're each
But
lobbying on
it would be nitrogen from land to sea still, but the sea part might be different if it wasn't within East Quogue.
So it wouldn't be impacting Weesuck Creek or Shinnecock necessarily?
Depending on where it lands. But I think it's open. It's not 100% clear. Jay, I don't know if you want to say anything about where those would land.
Well, the town has a different role than Typically, other towns, they allow the transfers anywhere within the town, where Southampton allows the transfers from a school district, within a school district. So if the properties in the core of the Pine Barrens, these credits were set up to provide value to the property owners in that core. So each, I think, acre was assigned one credit, and it had to have a value. If it had no value, they would have considered it taking. So those credits were set up that they could be transferred. Southampton said it's supposed to be in the same school district. So it's possible that there's not enough in the East Quogue School District to get to 30. I think there are some. I don't know exactly how many there are. But if there, apparently there's a lot in the West Hampton area. And, Quantuck Bay is another, heavily impaired water body. So,
It's a different school.
It's a different school district. So that would basically, by purchasing 30 credits, it's possible that some of those credits would have landed in the West Hampton area. It's possible, rather than the East Quogue area. Close by, but.
And my last one is, it's funny, you talked about the numbers for existing being dust in the air. Is there any chance that the impact of the construction of the golf course, which is something that I talk about, which is a concern, will increase temporarily while they're removing all that soil?
Probably not, just because it's within the same watershed, so, yeah. Yes?
Chris, the proposed fertilization rate, how does that compare to the standard fertilization rate for golf courses? And how would an increase, let's say double, affect your numbers?
The second half, how would it increase? I mean, obviously more fertilizer would increase the loading rates.
Yes, but at what rate? In other words, I think you said it's like 2 pounds per 1,000 acres or something.
That's per feet.
How does that compare to what golf courses generally use? And if it were double, how would that affect your number here? Would it?
I think it's actually less than golf courses usually use, and there's a standard golf course uses more than that. And there aren't the restrictions per se. I mean, town of Southampton is different, but if you're just talking about Long Island in general, it would be more nitrogen on some of the other golf courses.
I'm of the impression that it's like 2 or 3 times as much as is proposed. Well, maybe we should find that out.
Dolphin Bridge is around
3 is 5.
2 pounds. I think the Dolphin Bridge is under 2, just under 2, I think 1.9. I don't know Symphonic. Does anybody know Symfonic's rate? But it's probably the same as that.
1.2 pounds in Symphonic.
1.2 pounds.
Yeah.
10%.
So you'd be very conservative in your analysis.
So actually they're proposing using even more, but it's still going to be less.
No, it's just a cap.
So it's a casting. We're going to use that.
You cannot exceed them without risking closure of the course, financial penalties. None of the other courses have a fixed cap. So if they're approaching that cap, let's say in August, they would have to slow down on fertilizer. Because if they exceed it, they're done. Grass turns brown, whatever. But no other course, I don't know if any other course in the nation would have a cap like that. A mandatory not to exceed number.
What happens if they did exceed that cap?
If they knowingly exceed it, the town would have the ability to close the facility.
With all due respect, towns.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
The town's record in enforcing things is a little dismal. And it seems improbable that if you're going to close the course, that you would really take such a drastic action. So, having a cap that is not enforceable.
No, it would be enforceable.
Well, it would be enforceable, but if it's not enforced, it's not enforceable. You're not going to close the course, right?
It would be, possibly, sure. It would be a deeded condition of the approval that they would have to abide by this cap. And they'd have, obviously, there'd be money that would be put into a fund for the monitoring, just like Symphonic pays for the monitoring, the bridge pays for the monitoring, so you have that program, and this would be an increased level of monitoring, because You can't just do it quarterly. You need to be there frequently. You know, each product of fertilizer has a poundage of nitrogen on it, whether it's a bag or a liquid form. It's completely, you can calculate exactly where you are on a daily basis in terms of where that cap is. So you know how many square feet you have of cleared area. You know how many pounds of nitrogen you've applied so far. You have to budget yourself. And you know, to the degree that the town enforces the code, I hope that the town in the future does the right thing and enforces the code.
Well, that would be great, but historically, the town hasn't enforced it.
I don't know, I agree with that, but.
Any final questions? Okay, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.